welcome you all as you're streaming into the room. It's great to see you. Fantastic to be able to welcome you once again. We'll get started in the next 10 seconds or so. Just once a few more people have been able to join us. Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to see you. This is fantastic. So by way of introduction, welcome to another seminar in the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence series. We have a seminar every fortnight, and the group, the organisation, comprises of the University of Manchester, Chester University and Manchester Metropolitan University. Perhaps you joined us last fortnight for Professor John Pierre from the University of Gothenburg, who was speaking about the COVID crisis in Sweden. Today we are very pleased to welcome a new guest who's not presented to us before, Dr. Andy Smith. He's a leading expert in French politics and political economy as well, more generally. You may have seen his book published with Oxford University Press, which is The Politics of Economic Activity. And we're very pleased to be the very first, I think, to hear some of the latest research that he's going to be publishing very soon in 2021 with Manchester University Press, our very own university press at Manchester, with his book Made in France. And he's going to be sharing some of that with us today. If you were here last time, you'll know that you can send questions to me using the Q&A function. And Dr. Smith will be speaking for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have about the same amount of time for questions. But without further ado, it is a real pleasure, please, to welcome Dr. Andy Smith.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you everyone for being there somewhere out there on this rather special day. Special for me because I'm talking to you, but all special because of this election that's going on. You might have heard of it. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk to you today, as Paul said, about today, is a book that's I've written on France, a massive subject, of course, and that's going to come out in February, March time. I've called it Made in France, as you see, and really it's an attempt to give an overview of my view based on research done by many other people of what structures France politically and societally today, and why this is so, and in particular whether this has changed significantly over the last 30 years or so. So if we move on to the second slide, please. Yeah, on to the next, where have we got to now? Yeah, that's it. So why France? Well, I mean, in a way, it's because I've been here 30 years, and it's a way of celebrating that, I suppose, in a way. I also wrote the book partly because I had a whole host of funding bids refused. So I thought, well, they can't stop me writing. So I decided to do some writing. But that also led me to read on a whole load of subjects that I wasn't used to reading on, as you'll see below. Also more scientific reasons, I think, for looking at France, doing this book. Firstly, over my career, I've sort of developed a generic approach to societal structuring, the role of politics in that, and I wanted a book-length manuscript with which to develop that approach and test it against a number of substantive issues. Secondly, there are of course many introductory books to France, general books on France, but I couldn't really think of one that over a whole book developed a thesis. So a synthesis with a thesis, if you like, making some claims, causal claims about France. And in particular, as I said before, I wanted to look at, well, what's happened in particular since the 80s, a time that in many countries, for a number of reasons, we consider a lot has changed since the 80s, and I'll come back to that point. And finally, I also wanted to showcase a wide range amount of French research, most of it published in French, that I consider is often of very high quality, but is unfortunately largely unknown outside of France. So the book is also about that in many respects. If we move on to the next slide. So what is the thesis that I want to develop? I think the generic one that I would apply to other countries too, is that as with any long-standing society, France is very much structured by its institutions and the power relations that structure the various social fields that make up France. By institutions, I want to underline that I don't mean organizations, I mean stabilized rules, norms, expectations. Taking, for example, the educational sector as being structured by very much by these institutions. And if we stay with education, of course, the way French education is structured is very much affected by the power of those, for example, who dominate certain, if we look at secondary education, higher education, certain types of higher education as regards others, and in particular what the French call les grandes écoles, rather than universities as they're called in France. So universities actually have a very different meaning in France than they do in most other countries. And although I'm very much a structuralist from that point of view, I also am very much interested in agency, and I've developed the concept of political work to try and pin down this agency, which brings me to my second point. As I say, societies are very much structured, but that doesn't mean that they don't change, or that there are not actors who are trying to resist change constantly. And for me, political work, as I try to develop throughout the book, is something, it's not just an amorphous category. It can be broken down into three overlapping processes, which I examine in the book. The first being the construction of public problems. So it's the basic issue, one of the basic tenets of political sociology in many senses is that the issues which are dealt with by public authorities are not just out there, they are constructed and shaped and oriented before they are developed, public policies are developed to deal with them. The second point about instrumentation, well, that indeed is about the policies that are developed, but these instruments can take many forms and don't always go in the direction of those who that were initially designed by those who set them up. And what one very much needs to take seriously how and why these instruments and problems are seen as legitimate, both by other public actors and interest groups and so forth, but also by the citizenship in general. So the general approach is one that one could be qualified as both structuralist and constructivist. If we move on now, from there, I also I developed this this approach, and of course I spent some time thinking, well, how am I going to talk about France? And so I thought, well, why not try and go from the cradle to the grave? If you live in France, or your life is structured by the society you live in from the moment you're born until you leave this world. So as you can see there, I won't go through all the chapters, but basically I go through from very early childhood, even from the question of birthing, which is also structured societally, I would argue, right through to growing old and passing on, both in the way that one goes. There's a section on funerals and how the funeral sector is regulated in France, but there's also a sector, perhaps more importantly, on the questions of inheritance and things that Thomas Piketty analyzes a great deal in his work on 21st century capitalism. So I'll come back to the contents page as we go through, because obviously that's where the substance of the book is, but I think we can leave that there for now. So what am I going to do just in the time that we have left? I'm very conscious that I can't present the whole book, and I really don't want to bore you to tears with that. I just want to highlight firstly how in each of the chapters, and particularly overall, I try to address three causal claims that are frequently made about societal change, and I'm going to present those briefly now. Then I'm going to skip to the general conclusion of the book and sort of show you what do those claims actually turn out to be once one's looked at living in France from the cradle to the grave. So if we could go on to the thanks. So very briefly, and I'm aware that presenting them like this presents these claims a bit. The expression is straw man. It's not very well gendered, that straw woman, but in the sense of they can be seen as caricatures. But the first causal claim that's often made about France, as it is about many other countries of the world, is that since the mid 1980s, France has experienced a neoliberalization of its societal structures. And one might be surprised that this has happened in France, because prior to that, France had just experienced a fairly long period of high public interventionism. So I think that partly explains why there are these claims out there that, but everything's changed since the 80s. Everything's been neoliberalized. That's the first claim. I'll come back to that. The second claim is, of course, you've all heard this in wherever you come from, and in Britain in particular, I'm sure, is that during this period, well, there's been neoliberalization, but also there's been globalization. Often people are not very precise about what they mean by that, but in any sense, there's definitely a literature out there that says, well, France has become like many other countries. It has been globalized because markets and the economy in general is now global, they claim. This has, as an exogenous sort of shock, caused France to change and become like many other countries. And obviously this partly goes hand in hand with the first claim about neoliberalization. And then there's another claim that's a little bit different, and I try to deal with as well, about social mobility, and one that suggests that yes, there has been perhaps a widening gap between richer and poorer, but that's partly because French society, as with other societies in the Western world in particular, has become more individualized, one where people are also perhaps a bit more materialistic than they were before. And some authors have even suggested that, in fact, what one has experienced in France in the last 40 years is a rise of a certain embourgeoisement. What does that mean? A growth of the bourgeoisie, what would perhaps more sort of upper middle to upper class values, I think we'd call that more easily in the British case. So I wanted to look at that claim as well. So if we go on, I'll just go back to each of those claims and how I initially reformulated, and then in the conclusion, I'll really come back and say what I think about the claims. So as you can see, the slide here, yes, of course, there's been some neoliberalization, but one has to really see how neoliberalism has played out in the French sense. Firstly, reminding oneself that prior to 1940, France was a very liberal country. This point is often forgotten. The state was very weak up till that point, and it was only really in the period from 1945, and particularly 1950, until the 80s, where the French interventionist, the French word is dirigiste, state really developed. One marked by a lot of public intervention, but in particular by a state whose civil servants were a sort of caste, very much trained and specialized to push the so-called modernization of France. And so I think what's important to realize is that since the 80s, partly neoliberalization has allowed the liberals to come out of the cupboard in a sense. Liberal thought has become legitimate again. But at the same time, there are many actors who still cling to the interventionist policy recipes and public problem definitions that they developed in the years 1944 to 1980. So, whereas there's a very much a visible presence of neoliberal instruments and discourse in France, as in many other countries, what I really set out to do was to try and find out issue area by issue area, the kind of hybrids between liberalism, interventionism, and neoliberalism that have come to structure contemporary France. If we move on to globalization, here I take up Colin Hay's idea that, well, globalization, you need to be careful. Markets may have changed, but they don't automatically change the way that national institutions and power relations are shaped. Rather, globalization is often an argument, a weapon used to try and bring about change of institutions and power relations that actors wanted to bring about in any case. And this is clear, for example, in my chapter on the business, on business in France. Many former people who would define themselves as liberals in France have used the globalization thesis to push for privatization of French industry, a downplaying of the involvement of unions in social policy, and more generally, more activist approaches to employment policy, and so on. I'm sure you've all heard of these policy recipes before, and they certainly exist in France. But really, what I begin to argue at the beginning of the book, and then it becomes more prominent throughout the book, is that yes, globalization, actors are struggling with what that means for them in different issue areas. But where it really has a causal effect of any type is when actors have given themselves tools with which to use this as a weapon to change institutions or power relations. And finally, the third cross-cutting argument is this claim that there is increased individualization. This explains, for example, they say, the drop in union membership in France, which fell dramatically since the 80s, much more than in countries such as Britain even, and there are a whole other. I mean, even the way I've got a chapter on sport and culture, and you can see that the types of sports people get involved in now, as opposed to 40 years ago, in terms of proportions, are much more individual sports than collective sports, and so on. And a lot of social commentators extrapolate from that and say, well, this individualization is rampant, and that explains, for example, volatile voting patterns, the fact that people no longer join political parties, and so on. And I'm sure there's some truth in that. But what interests me more as I go through the book is to see how this idea that the individual is now an important category of social and political thought is used particularly to legitimize changes in institutions and power relations. So I kind of reformulate the claim saying, well, let's really look at how the individual has been worked upon politically to bring about change. So we can move now to two sets of arguments I make in the general conclusion. Firstly, I try to sum it up and say, well, what really has changed and what has not changed since the 1980s, and if things have changed or not, what are the causes of this change or reproduction? So in the next slide, I have a table that probably needs a bit of explaining, but it's a way of trying to sum up very succinctly what I consider has changed or not significantly as regards the institutions and power relations that structure contemporary France. To do so, I've used a basic typology developed first by Peter Hall about orders of change. Basically, to Peter Hall, it's quite a simple typology, really. A third order change is really a radical change, a paradigmatic change, if you like. The whole ethos of the way a policy area, for example, is run has undergone change. Whereas a second order change, well, you have a certain degree of change of policy instruments, but essentially the the aim of the policy as a whole has not changed fundamentally. And first order change is quite, well, as you would expect, it's a kind of slight change, but it's really about the calibration of policy. For example, the types of the amount of subsidy that farmers get for doing certain things now as regards they got what they got 40 years ago. So really it's an extent of change. And then of course, well, you have to consider that there can be cases where there's been no change at all. And indeed, that's what I find in certain parts of the issue areas that I look at in the book. And if we look at that column, I'm just going to concentrate on the columns reproduction and third order change. So what hasn't changed over the last 40 years? Well, one aspect that I think hasn't changed much is a lot of the way that education, primary and secondary education, is institutionalized and structured in contemporary France. It's still remarkably adult-centered. If you look at the way children are taught, if you look at the power of teachers, it really hasn't changed significantly over the last 40 years. Teachers are, in many senses, a corporation that, of course, the state has, in particular, has attempted to change. In particular, saying, well, look at the way it's been done in Sweden, or look at the way it's been done in the UK. For example, an example I develop in the book, just 3 or 4 years ago, at French primary schools, they tried to move them from a 4-day week with very long school days to a 5-day week with long school days that were much lower. This policy was introduced by under the last president, François Hollande. It lasted, I think it's 1 or 2 years maximum, and then it was completely abandoned without any evaluation of the policy having been made, and which really shows that in this issue area, it's really very impervious to both to what parents think and want, but also to what academic research on education has suggested is best for children. So I have a whole other set of arguments about the adult-centeredness of education and indeed child rearing in France, which it seems to me hasn't fundamentally changed in over the time examined. Capital labor relations has changed. I won't talk about that now. Another very interesting point that I find, the world of business has changed in many regards, but what certainly hasn't is the internal hierarchy of French companies. This is something that's not often recognized, but it's very much what's it linked to? Well, it's linked to the fact that it gets promoted within French companies, particularly because of the diploma that one has, not so much because of the experience one has. And this in turn links to the importance of certain types of higher education, especially what the French call les grandes écoles, where people can leapfrog because of their diploma other people within companies. As you can imagine, this creates a lot of disharmony, and I think that I found that was a particularly salient example of a lack of change in France since the 80s. And another area where the state, where things have not changed, is the fact that the state is also very much involved in political activism, in the sense that we find, I think in Britain we would find this particularly surprising, but interest groups, particularly environmental interest groups, can get quite a lot of support, financial support to exist. So there's a sort of state-sponsored activism that exists in France, and political parties themselves in France. Of course, this is not specific to France, but they without the state subsidy, they would have enormous difficulty in functioning at all, because they have such low membership levels and low resources from their members. and that again hasn't changed very much. Perhaps more interestingly it still is to look at what has changed since the 80s. And one of the things that really interested me is that for secondary education in particular, there's been a rise of private education in France. Of course, private education never went away completely in France, particularly because the Catholic Church ensured that it didn't, but it's certainly been on the rise since the 80s, and particularly in the last 15 years. In terms of capital-labor relationships, as I've alluded to before, the trade union influence has declined significantly in many areas of French life, but they are still present, as one sees through the demonstrations and so on, which often I know also reach British TV and so on. One's always intrigued by the amount of activism and the way that the French still take to the streets when, for example, over pension reform and so forth. But that kind of, often it masks the sort of day-to-day decreasing influence of the unions. And not surprisingly, as the unions have decreased in influence, the influence of the peak business association has increased, and their business people have certainly worked politically in order to have greater access to the changing of institutions and power relations as regards business. And perhaps if I jump to the final segment there about union and party membership, particularly party membership, as many of you will know, there's been a collapse of the Parti Socialiste, so the Socialist Party, and we now have well, it's not really a centre-right, I'd say it's a right, orthodox right-wing party, which is now called Les Républicains, which is in complete disarray at the moment, partly because of the rise of of President Macron's party in the last couple of years, a party created to support his presidential bid, but also more generally, both the Parti Socialiste and Les Républicains, which were previously the parties of government in France, at least since the 80s, are in disarray. They really are massive internal disputes about what they're supposed to stand for, and not to mention who they are going to put forward as candidates in a whole series of elections. So that is quite a change from the situation in the 80s, where things were relatively stable, and the party system as a whole has clearly experienced an upheaval. One which I try to I use the literature, the French literature on this, that says, of course, part of that is linked to the rise of extreme right parties, to the rise of green parties. Of course, there is this sort of slightly exogenous cause for their change, but there are also a whole series of reasons to look at when one looks at the internal functioning of each of these parties and sees that, contrary to what happened prior to the 1980s, really they're empty shells, both these parties. So why have these things changed or not? And I get to my last slide, and then I'm going to stop, and hopefully if there are any questions from you. So what I conclude is, well, there's no direct causal role for neoliberalism or globalization. Neither of these on their own have changed France from what it was in the 80s to what it is today. But both, in certain issue areas, combined with the individual as a category of political thought and action, have led to significant change in areas ranging from education, as I said, rise of private education, for example, to employment policy, very much turned more to the so-called active activist employment policy that one is used to in the UK in particular. And I would argue that a lot of this change has been brought about by actors, I'm not saying they consciously did this, but their political work has been marked by cherry picking different aspects of the neoliberal doxa, the weapon of globalization, and the rhetoric of, well, in today's society, it's the individual that counts, which has been used to normalize and push forward agendas in all these areas, ranging from education to political parties, to the regulation of the funeral sector, and I could add others as well. However, there are other cases where reproduction has prevailed and no change. And I think this, again, one can look at the neoliberalism, globalization, the individual, and here raise the question, well, how come in these sectors, in these areas, this combination of arguments has not been used as, or has not been used effectively in order to bring about change? And I cite firstly the argument of the management of firms, what I mentioned earlier about internal firm hierarchies, state involvement in the NGOs, the importance of les grandes écoles like ENA, Polytechnique, and these schools, they're schools in the sense of higher education schools. All these institutions are still very much in place. So I think they're really what I say, neoliberalism, globalization, the individual has not really been used to politically work upon and see these institutions as problematic, as necessitating change. Or there is also another alternative in certain areas where there has been collective action that has emerged to fight against the arguments, the neoliberalization, globalization, individual combination. And I think the example of teaching unions, and not only the unions, but others who support the status quo in French education, have been quite effective in using this type of political work to counter the neoliberalism, globalization, individual rhetoric. And then another example that you may have seen on your screens last year and the year before, the Gilets jaunes, so the yellow jackets, the people who took to the street, people who'd never, most of them had never really been involved in activism before, but who, in this case, decided to work in a very unorthodox, well, unorthodox in the sense that they're not formally organized, but also using the street demonstration, and some would say even violence, to try and counter a series of changes that affected, ranging from fuel price increases to the closure of services in rural areas, and many other aspects. So that also I try to look at in the book. So just to finish, obviously there's much more that could be said about what's in the book, much more that could be said about France, much more that needs discussing, because I put out a whole load of ideas based on my research and that of other people in the book, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be discussed. On the contrary, I'd like it to be discussed if anyone's interested enough. What I would say is that it's certainly been an experience that has taught me a lot, having trying to look at something as global as how a country is structured. I was more trained to look at things that were much more specific, like sectors or particular issues and so on, but I've tried to stand back and look at France as a whole. I think I would in future like to do that again, try and do that about the UK, for example, but for that I'd need to come back and stay in the UK for a while, which would be great. But or even look at Spain, which is another country that I've worked on a little bit, but I would love to work on that frontally. So in a sense, I'm saying that what I'm been trying to do here is move progressively towards a form of comparative analysis that I'm not used to doing, and I don't think is done that much at the moment, where one has, for very good reasons, moved away from country to country comparisons, but perhaps through producing books a bit like mine, perhaps one can get back into a conversation about that sort of comparison, a sort of comparison that we often associate with old political science, but perhaps there may be some use in getting back to that sort of comparative analysis at some point. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. That was so illuminating. We felt very lucky, I know I did, to get to hear your latest research before it even comes out. That's absolutely fantastic. I've seen that the chat thread has had some comments just popping up, but I know that this is, and to a large degree, Konstantinos encouraging people. Konstantinos is behind the scenes, making sure everything happens. So if you have questions, please do write either in the chat thread or using the Q&A function at the bottom. For example, I know if you're doing my second year course on comparative West European politics, almost everything Andy talked about there is going to be what we discussed in next week's topic. So it couldn't have been more perfect, and I will be able to hopefully cite you before your book comes out, Andy. But if I could start off the questions myself, you talked in the final slide about neoliberalization or neoliberalism, globalization, and the individual collectively being a dimension that pushes the Socialist Party and Labour Républicain into disarray. But I was wondering a little bit more about those other parties. Have they been able to withstand that combination? And if so, why is that the case? Or is it simply the fact that they had the most to lose, essentially, by being the previously dominant parties?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I'm trying to make up an answer a bit on the hoof here because I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's a very good way of raising the question. And I apologize for going a bit over time then. I got carried away, I'm afraid. So I think, firstly, let's look at President Macron's party. I think Macron's party, I mean, really, they're kind of a synthesis of this. They're very much purveyors of, and they're quite upfront about it. They consider that, yeah, globalization is something that just imposes itself on a country. You just have to change. So this is why we need pension reform, radical pension reform. That's what they say. They consider that, well, neoliberal recipes are the best, so we should be moving towards more private pensions, for example. And they think, well, you know, the pensions should be more individualized to fit with the importance of the individual. So in a way, it's all a bit too neat in the sense that they totally buy into this. What's more interesting is to say that actually, while in government, they see that, well, they're coming up against a whole series of, well, a load of opposition saying, well, actually, no, we don't see France like that, and we don't see the problem as being that. We're very much committed to our the collective bargaining through which pension arrangements have been set in the past. We're very much committed to certain professions having certain rights because they work for them. You know, the people who work at night or the people who you know, the police or whatever, they should be allowed to retire early and so on. So some of them, it's quite amazing, partly because they're very new to politics. They're, in a way, they're quite naive. They kind of think, oh, we weren't expecting that sort of opposition. What happened there, sort of thing. So I think that's one interesting example. And then another example, let's take the Front National. Well, I still call them that. They call themselves, what do they call themselves? They're trying to not
National
be
Rally,
the
yes.
front anymore, but so the extreme right. No, well, they see, well, one can fight globalization, but the way to fight globalization is to shut the borders and especially you know, be extremely negative about immigrants and keep them out as much as possible and kick them out if you can. So and neoliberalism is seen as something, you know, anathema. You shouldn't be doing that. What you should be doing instead is not very clear, but they don't need to be very clear because well, they don't think they need to be very clear. So I would say I need to think more about this, but I think it's interesting to see how parties position themselves around this sort of triptych, if I may say.
Fantastic. Thank you for answering that. And we also have a question that's come up through the thread from Alex. And Alex asks, what is the reason for the rise of private education at the lycée and college levels? And why has this trend not extended to primary school?
Great question. Yeah. No, I think, well, one of the reasons is that, well, clearly there are areas of France, as there are in many other countries, where there are schools that are in difficulty and they lack resources. They also, there's a vicious circle, because when the schools develop a reputation for being difficult, obviously many teachers don't want to be there, and they try to get transferred out. So that's the youngest teachers who ended up being sent there, because the French system, you kind of have to do you have to do the hard yards at the beginning of your career, and then you develop points, and then you might end up getting a posting to some region which is reputed to be much easier to teach in. So there's that aspect to it, both about parental choice as regards the perception of failing schools, but also what teachers do as regards the perception of failing schools. But I think even more importantly is, and this is, it took me some years before I understood this in France, but actually the French state subsidizes private education in France. And this goes back to a deal they struck with the church decades ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. And so actually private schools are very cheap in France compared to most other countries. They're very cheap because the teachers are paid for by the state. So this is one of the, the massive paradoxes of the great French commitment to being if not anti-clerical, neutral on religion, and also very statist. Well, it's not. I mean, basically, the state itself has given a helping hand to private education, and as you liberalize adjacent areas to education, there has been a whole movement of people who want to make money in education. So the supply has changed. There's been more private schooling, and this is even more apparent in higher education, where business schools in particular, there's just a plethora of these business schools now, taking loads of money from people for not very good education on the whole. Anyway, don't get me started about that, but good question.
I have a question, if I may, as well, and I'll just say we have time for maybe two more, and we don't have one at the top of the list from the audience just yet, so I'll ask one as chair, and then there's time for one more if the audience would like to contribute one. But my question is this: we often talked in recent decades about France having quite a specific variety of capitalism, its dirigiste style, and I was wondering to what extent, I know you ended your talk by saying that you were looking forward to the next stage of research being more comparative, but at this stage, would you say that France does still continue to offer a specific variety of capitalism in contrast, say, to much of Western Europe, or have they become more similar over time?
Yeah, I think there's still a singularity. It's shifted. It's not as clearly interventionist, to use the French word dirigiste, as it was. There's some very good research by Ben Clift, who's at Warwick University. He talks about post-dirigisme. He considers that the French interventionist model has changed somewhat. I talk more about neo-dirigisme because I think it's kind of been reinvented. Now, why is it still there? It's there partly because there is a widely shared belief, even amongst liberals in France, that for some things you do need public interventionism. It can be a good thing to subsidize certain things. If you want an agriculture, you should subsidize it, and so on. But also the other aspect of dirigism, of the French model, is this very strong state, and where there is authority for French bureaucrats who are trained for many years to get to where they are, and they're still there. And the argument I make in the book is that actually this neo-dirigiste model is it's still quite durable, and indeed it's being pushed at the level of the European Union, because, as you are all aware, the French actors are very much active in pushing for policy initiatives at the European scale. It doesn't mean they always win, but in many ways, French neo-dirigism has been shored up in France, partly by ensuring that European legislation doesn't stop them doing what they want to do in various sectors.
I see. Thanks so much, Andy. We have one final question from Billy. And Billy asks, please can you tell us a little bit more and comment on the rise of Euroscepticism in France, specifically with regards to this idea you discuss of fierce individualism within France?
Yeah, well, Euroscepticism, as you know, as you rightly say, it's strong in France. We've seen that around referenda in the past, haven't we? Where things haven't gone the way that the government at the time wanted them to go. Yeah, I think on one level, the breakdown of organized political parties who engage with people over, their members over long years and encourage them to vote in certain ways and even to think politically in certain ways, clearly has an impact on the way many individuals think in France as elsewhere. And I think there is an argument for saying that yes, the breakdown not only of political parties but also of unions has gone hand in hand with perhaps a less structured debate about the European Union, as with many other issues in France, that has given rise to some of the unexpected results and so on. But at the same time, I don't think one should give too much credence to this individualization thesis, just because people consider that the individual is more important than previously. Doesn't mean that they are individualistic and that they're just looking after number one. The research doesn't really show that. I'm not a specialist of political behavior and public opinion, but my colleagues who are underline that point. There's a kind of paradox. There's a lot of rhetoric about the importance of the individual, and it's true that some social practices are clearly becoming more individualized, but that doesn't mean that we're all becoming more selfish and just looking after number one. So I think the whole Euroscepticism question is a complex one. And also, I would like to bring into that debate the whole question, well, what are the politicians who are in favor of the European Union actually saying to get people to believe in the project? I know this is probably quite salient in the UK, a bit late, but for those who believe in it. But it's about political supply in a sense. And in France, many of the people who defend the European Union don't really know how it works, and they just sort of say, well, we must defend it because it's worked since the 1950s and because it's helped us avoid a third world war, or all these sort of very vague arguments that don't have any resonance to younger people, or particularly people who are not part of the elites, who don't travel much in Europe and don't really know what's going on outside the French borders. So I think that a lot of the rise of Euroscepticism should be put at the door of people who've been defending the European Union for very woolly reasons, and also pushing it to become more and more neoliberal and less engaged with the daily lives of so many of its people. That's an argument I don't really make in this book, but I make in other things that I've written.
There we go. Sorry, I was on mute. I know I can't wait to read the book. I know the last point you were finishing on is elsewhere in your research rather than the forthcoming book, but certainly I, for one, will be reading it. It's 2021, isn't it, that it comes out with Manchester University Press. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, just before we say thank you to Andy, can I just flag up that in 2 weeks' time, we have Professor Sophia Vassilopoulou, who will be presenting on the rise of the far right within Europe, and specifically the ideas around why protesters versus nationalists are two different communities who vote for the far right, and how there may be limitations as to the far right capturing more votes. But that's 2 weeks away, same time, same place. For now, please join me in thanking Dr. Andy Smith from Sciences Po Bordeaux for a fantastic speech seminar. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and I hope we can meet again some way in the future. Okay,
I definitely hope so too. Thanks, everyone. Take care. We hope to see you in a fortnight. All the best.